Good morning, everybody. How are you all? You guys able to see me okay? You guys here? Hello? Okay, cool. Good morning to you all. Welcome for joining. Happy Monday. So, very good. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. It is 7:40. Hello. Thank you again for joining us. The first thing that we're going to cover today is something unrelated to Euro. It is a message from the principal. You may have seen this. I believe they sent out an email about it or whatever. But in case you didn't, I am being asked by administration to share this with you. So go ahead and check out that link there in the chat. And it should bring you to a website with a video from Dr. Goins, our principal, and he is going to walk you through instructions on how to properly sign into Zoom using your login credentials and stuff like that. So please do take a minute to watch that if you have not done so already. I believe it is only about a minute long, so go ahead and do that right now. So for those of you just joining us, I sent you a link from a message from Dr. Goins. It's very short, just something to show you how to properly log into Zoom for your other classes. But we use YouTube Live here, so it's not for us, but nonetheless. All right, so hopefully you have now had the opportunity to watch that, and we are going to proceed with those things that we must complete for AP Euro today. So the first thing that we're going to do today is I am going to be reading, and you are going to be reading, an excerpt. I have ants all over my desk. I don't even have any food in here, but there's ants everywhere. All right, now. You're going to be reading a little piece from a book, okay? And this book is written by a historian named William Manchester. Now, this book is, by history standards, it's a little bit old. It was made in the late 80s or early 90s sometime. I think like 91 or something like that was the last edition of the book. But so it's been out for a while. but it's on the late Middle Ages. And, you know, what I would like you to keep in mind as we go through not only this source, but really any source that we use in this class, remember that arguments are based on evidence, okay? And in order to build strong historical arguments, you're going to want to have a collection of evidence that you're gathering throughout the semester. So when we read stuff like this, I really want you to treat it like a little artifact that you can put into your knapsack or whatever, okay, and pull out when you need it. Okay, so try and consider readings in this class, especially these documents. Now, this is a secondary historical source. A secondary source means that the guy that wrote it wasn't there witnessing it at the time. It's a historical argument made after the fact. Now, it's not to say that secondary sources are bad. In fact, several secondary sources are really, really, really good. We probably will use more primary than secondary sources in the class, but secondary sources are good to help you build perspective on what people who know more about this than you have said in the past, and the arguments that they've made. And some of those arguments, secondary source arguments, can be really, really strong arguments supported by really excellent evidence. And I would consider this one of those. But then there's other sources, primary documentation resources. And primary resources are kind of interesting. You might sometimes, so a primary resource could, for example, be like quite legitimately like like a historical actor who was like a diary entry or something like that of somebody who was fighting in World War II or something. Okay, that would be considered a secondary source. It's a historical piece of evidence from the time, from that era that was collected and gathered. But the thing that's interesting about primary resources is sometimes they can come from kind of unexpected places. So let's take a newspaper article. A newspaper article typically, okay, or a magazine advertisement or something like that. A magazine advertisement or a newspaper article, you might think of them as being like secondary sources, because a newspaper article in particular is going to be written by a journalist who likely was not there and is writing about it after the fact. So that could be considered a secondary resource. However, sometimes if we're looking at things from a different angle, the newspaper itself becomes a primary resource. And the reason for that is because, like, let's say that you were doing historical argument on the credibility of the media, okay, on the credibility of the media, or something to do with like media bias or something like that in history. In those situations, the newspaper articles, you're reading them with a totally different idea in mind, and that would make that article that you're reading no longer really a secondary source, because you're not really reading it for the content per se. You're not reading to learn more about the facts of what they're talking about in the article. You're reading it to discern bias, or you're reading it to discern some sort of broader historical trend. And in that scenario, then the paper could become a primary resource. So it just kind of depends on how you're using the source on whether it's a primary or secondary source. But if we're reading it to develop an understanding of the content, or if we're reading it to understand the various perspectives that different historians have on a particular issue, like in this case, we're talking about the late Middle Ages, those would be secondary resources. So without further ado, now that I've set this up with way too much detail, but it's important stuff. What we're going to now do, I'm going to have you go over to Canvas, click on the Files tab, and then in the Files tab, there should be now a PDF on there that I just uploaded called W.M. Manchester, meaning William Manchester. And William Manchester wrote this piece called A World Lit Only by Fire. A World Lit Only by Fire. That's the name of the book. Now, we're not going to read the whole book, obviously. It's several hundred pages long. But what I've done is I've taken a couple of excerpts from the beginning of this book, because what William Manchester does really nicely in this piece is he sets up just how different the Middle Ages were from our modern times. Now, remember that when he wrote this, he was living in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, so it's not really from our modern times, technically. In fact, there will be certain things in here that you could read that might lead you to realize that this piece is not from modern history. It's from about 30 or 40 years ago. And so, he talks about wrist watches and stuff like that. There's not going to be any mention of smartphones or the internet or anything like that. So he is writing from his own historical discourse from 30 years ago here, which is important to keep in mind. But we're not reading it for that. We're reading it for his argument on the late Middle Ages. So I still am not able to screen share. I'm really hoping that ability comes to me this week. Otherwise, I would pop my screen over, and you could just read along with me on the YouTube video here. But you're going to have to pull it up on your own screen on a separate tab. And if you want, you can go like split screen mode, so you can read on one side and keep the chat up on the other. That's what I'm going to be doing over here. And then I'm going to open this up on my screen so I don't have to look down to read. World Lit Only by Fire, William Manchester. Okie dokie. So zoom in on this so I can see what I'm doing here. All right. So we're going to start just a little bit below where that little mark is, about a quarter down the page there, where it says, was the medieval world a civilization comparable to Rome? Okay, so actually I'm going to read this because it's easier to read. Okay, so here we go. Was the medieval world a civilization comparable to Rome before it, meaning like the Roman Empire, or to the modern era which followed? One of the things before I get going with this, I want you to be picking apart using some of those techniques that we talked about last class, Persia in particular. What kinds of arguments is he making? What's the historical claim that William Manchester is making here? I want you to be reading this with a discerning eye. Don't just passively read it. Read it against the grain. Remember, we want to read it with a discerning eye to pick apart and analyze what this historian is telling us, what argument he's making, what evidence he's using. Okay, so I want you to be trying to incorporate some of those Persia techniques as we go through here to categorize the arguments that he's making. Okay, so was it a civilization? Was the late Middle Ages a civilization comparable to Rome before it, or the modern era which followed it? Okay, if by a civilization one means a society which has reached a relatively high level of cultural and technological development, the answer is no. During the Roman millennium, meaning the 1,000 years roughly that the Roman Empire was around, imperial authorities had controlled the destinies of all the lands within the empire, from the Atlantic in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east, from the Antonine Wall in northern Britain to the Upper Nile Valley in the south. Enlightened Romans had served as teachers, lawgivers, builders, and administrators. Romans had reached towering pinnacles of artistic and intellectual achievement. Their city had become the physical and spiritual capital of the Roman Catholic Church. The age which succeeded it, which is the one that we're talking about, the late Middle Ages, accomplished none of these. Trade on the Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now perilous. Vandal pirates and then Muslim pirates lay athwart the vital sea routes. Agriculture and transport were inefficient. The population was never fed adequately. A barter economy, which is trading things, yielded to coinage only because the dominant lords, enriched by plunder and conquest, needed some form of currency to pay for wars, ransoms, their departure on crusades, the knighting of their sons and their daughters' marriages. Back in the olden days, wealthy or well-to-do folks would have to, particularly fathers, would pay a dowry along with their daughter to have her married to another family. And if you didn't have a dowry to provide from the wives or from the potential wives' family, the daughter's family, you likely were not going to get married. Okay, royal treasury officials were so deficient in elementary skills that they were dependent upon arithmetic learned from the Arabs. The name exchequer emerged because they used a checkered cloth as a kind of abacus, which is an old school calculator, in doing sums. If their society was diverse and colorful, it was also anarchic, formless, and appallingly unjust. Now, when we say anarchic, simply that means almost like without government. Now, it's not that they didn't have any government, but very chaotic, okay? Nevertheless, it possessed its own structure and peculiar institutions, which evolved almost imperceptibly over the centuries. Medievalism was born in the decaying ruins of a senile and impotent empire. It died just as Europe was emerging as a distinctive cultural unit. The interregnum, and in this scenario, he's using that word interregnum, period between reigns, in a broader way to describe the entire period of the late Middle Ages, the period of time between two civilizations, if you will. Okay, the interregnum was the worst of times for the imaginative, the cerebral, and the unfortunate. But the strong, the healthy, the shrewd, the handsome, the beautiful, and the lucky flourished. Europe was ruled by a new aristocracy, the noble, and ultimately the regal, noble being high-ranking member of society, regal meaning a kingly figure. After the barbarian tribes had overwhelmed the Roman Empire, men had established themselves as members of the new privileged classes in various ways. Any leader with a large following of free men was eligible to become a noble, though some had greater followings and therefore greater claims than others. In Italy, some were members of the Roman senatorial families, survivors who had intermarried with Goths or Huns. As Ovid had observed, a barbarian was suitable if he was rich. Others in the patriciate were landowners whose huge domains were worked by slaves and protected by armies of buculi. In England and France, the privileged might be descendants of Anglo, Saxon, Frank, Vandal, or Ostrogoth chieftains. Many German hierarchs belonged to very old families, revered since time immemorial, and therefore acceptable to the other princes. The Reichsfürstenstand, who had to approve each ennoblement. Because this was a time of incessant warfare, however, most noblemen had risen by distinguishing themselves in battle. In early centuries, distinction ended with the death of a man who had won it. But patrilineal descent, which we talked about last class of primogeniture and passing down titles and estates to your eldest born son, became increasingly common, creating dynasties. All right, titles evolved. Duke, and I'm just going to move through these. Anglo-Saxon earl, count, baron, and so on and so forth, skipping down. Serving these on the lowest run of the aristocratic ladder was the knight. Portuguese, let's see. Originally, the word meant a farmer of free birth. By the 11th century, knights were cavalrymen living in fortified mansions, each with his noble seal. All were guided, in theory at least, by an idealistic knightly code and bound by oath to serve, where am I at? Oh, to serve a higher noble is what it would say. I'm going to skip forward now. Okay, so I don't want to read the whole book for you, so I'm skipping forward now. Okay, so this gives you kind of a little bit of an idea of a background of the argument that this guy is making right now. And I wonder if any of you, go ahead in the chat actually, I wonder if any of you can tell me what's the major historical, after reading kind of the beginning introduction to this, right? This is, what we're doing here is we're doing some skill building, okay? I'm trying to get you to read with a little bit more deliberate intent. Okay, so why don't you type in the chat? What would you summarize in a phrase or a short sentence? What's the main idea, the main historical argument that William Manchester is making in this piece? Okay, so far that you're able to discern. Anyone want to be brave? You guys are quiet today. Is anyone there? Okay, cool. Yeah, Michelle, excellent. Nice. Yeah, he's definitely coming at it from I would say this is characterized by a lot of social stuff. Yeah, because he's talking about whether it's civilized or not. Nice response, by the way. Thank you so much. Yeah, Mehul, excellent. Yeah, 100%. That is the argument that he's making. William, you guys are doing great. Okay, fantastic. And if I didn't give you enough time to type out your thing, I apologize. But yeah, so far this is great. And that is exactly the argument that he's making. We're talking about the late Middle Ages as being a time of kind of the dark times. And think about the title of the book, A World Lit Only by Fire. Okay, A World Lit Only by Fire. Now, he's probably saying this with a little bit of tongue in cheek, right? Of course, they didn't have electricity back in the late Middle Ages, okay? They didn't have electricity, though, in the Roman Empire either, and they didn't have it for hundreds of years after the late Middle Ages. So it's really not about, like, walking around with torches, literally. The book is not about people in the late Middle Ages who own torches, obviously. Okay, so when we talk about... yeah, absolutely. Alicia, nice job. And Sarah, yep, exactly. Good. You guys are hitting the nail right on the head. Okay, excellent. So when we think about the title of this book, what do you suppose William Manchester is really implying when he says a world lit only by fire? What's the connotation there? What is he implying by saying that the late Middle Ages were a world lit only by fire, do you suppose? He's saying they're not as civilized. So far, what kinds of things has he said to support that argument? Because we've already read a few things in here now, pieces of evidence that he's used to support the claim that he's making, right? Because he's making a historical argument. That's what he's doing here. But you can't just throw something out there and expect that it's going to be accepted. You have to support this argument with evidence. So what kinds of things has he brought up so far already about why the late Middle Ages are really a world lit only by fire, or somehow not as advanced or civilized as the Roman Empire before it or the modern age that came after it? Okay, good. Michelle, nice. Other folks in here, we got 19 people in here. Anyone else want to contribute some ideas? Let me say the question again, in case you forgot it. What kinds of pieces of evidence has he brought up already in the first couple of pages that we've read through on here as reasons that he might be going into a little bit more depth on all right, because he's just outlining some kind of big ideas about why the Dark Ages or the late Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages are sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, okay? Why do you suppose, when we talk and think about that with the title too, the Dark Ages, a world lit only by fire, this is implying some things, right? What is it implying about, and what does he allude to in these first couple of pages here as pieces of evidence as to why the Roman Empire was so much more civilized than the Dark Ages? Fire being used more disordered, wasn't peace. Yeah, it's, again, try and think not literally about the fire, right? Try not to think literally about the actual fire. Think about the Dark Ages. What does this imply beyond the actual physical lighting of your environment? If we're referring to this period of time as the Dark Ages, and he's saying that we're not dealing with a period of time that's particularly civilized, okay, what pieces of evidence does he use in those first couple of pages? I'm looking at a couple of them literally right now. So what kinds of pieces of evidence does he say that distinguish the Romans as being civilized, but the Dark Ages is not? I'm pressing you because I want you to be able to do this. Good. Roman Empire had a better organized government. Yes. Trade routes across the Mediterranean Sea were no longer as safe. Yes. By the way, think about this: government, political, trade routes, economic, right? We're starting to categorize using those Persia categories. The people were not fed appropriately. Starvation, that's going to be a social thing, right? The economy is corrupt. Also intellectually, right? Think about intellectually. These people didn't even know how to do math properly. They had to consult the Ottomans, okay, living farther east in what is now known as the Middle East. In the military world, Middle Ages was not up to the mark as Roman millennium had control over all lands of Europe and some of Africa. Yeah, we're no longer dealing with a large consolidated empire. We're dealing with a fragmented society, lots of warfare, right? And also very, 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 very slow progress, okay? The Roman Empire was far more civilized, and there had been a lot of deterioration in the late Middle Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, what we're going to now do, I'm going to set up for you the medieval man. Now, when I say medieval man, this is not an attempt to be sexist or leave women out of the story. But we have to understand, as I mentioned last time, we're dealing with a very patriarchal society here. And so it was really very much understood across all of Christendom. Christendom is Christian Europe, essentially. Okay, it was really understood that man's seat at the top of the social hierarchy was a much more privileged position than women's position in society. Middle Ages were chaotic, okay, lacked a high level of cultural and technological development. Excellent, good, nice job. So you guys are picking out some good pieces of evidence there. And what I would like to do now is move on to that page 21. So we're going to start where it says the most baffling, okay, the most baffling. All right, so we'll start right there. If you want to go back over to the PDF and follow along as you read on the screen and I read from my page here. The most baffling, elusive, yet in many ways the most significant dimensions of the medieval mind were invisible and silent. One was the medieval man's total lack of ego. Now, when we say that word ego, if you've heard that word before, probably the way that you've heard it, if you hear of somebody who's egotistical or who has a huge ego, they probably think very highly of themselves. Ego is a reference to a term from the early days of psychology under Sigmund Freud, who was an Austrian physician. And he came up with this conceptualization of the personality and identified the ego as being the conscious awareness of one's own individual identity, right? And the ego was kind of your conscious awareness of your identity that you sought to protect. But what William Manchester is now arguing here about the medieval man was a total lack of ego. In other words, they really have no ego because they don't see themselves the same way that a person from modern times, particularly a person from America in modern times, because America is very highly individualistic. So individualistic, it's borderline narcissistic. And all I have to tell you about is all the millions of selfies that you've taken on your phone to select the right one before you post it and, try and get a bunch of likes on TikTok or Instagram, or I got to find a friend.com or whatever it is that you're using these days. Okay, so we're talking about the medieval man having a total lack of ego. Even people with creative powers had no sense of self. Each of the great soaring medieval cathedrals, our most treasured legacy from that age, required 3 or 4 centuries to complete. So it's not like it was a single builder or a single architect that was looking for some sort of fame or whatever from building these cathedrals, because the cathedrals weren't being built for individual awareness. And I want you to make a prediction right now about what you're thinking. And the reason, again, you might think that this is painstaking, that we're taking such a long time to read this, and that I'm forcing you to really dissect this. But the reason I'm doing it is because as I read through this, because I have a lot of experience reading historical texts, what I'm really trying to do for you here is to demonstrate how when I read something, I'm constantly asking myself questions, okay, as I read, and I'm making predictions, and I'm categorizing information. To me, it comes second nature because I've been doing this a really long time. But for you, I've been working with kids for a long time. Youngsters have a tendency to read things, particularly stuff from books or stuff in school, and just passively accept it as, well, it was written, so it must be true. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to be thinking and questioning and categorizing and analyzing as we go through every single thing in this class. So I want you to make a prediction right now. Why do you suppose that all of these huge cathedrals that were being built at this time weren't about individual recognition? What do you suppose the motivation then was for building them? Make a prediction. Type it in the chat. Michelle, nice. Thank you so much. And you've been contributing a lot today. Nice job. I think it was for something religious, so it was built as a contribution to God, but I'm not sure. God. Yes, 100%. Absolutely right. It is built for glorification of God, okay? They are not living their lives on earth in the late Middle Ages for themselves. They are not at all concerned about their earthly existence. There is one and one concern only, okay? And that is going to heaven, the afterlife, right? They want to go to heaven. They're building these cathedrals for the glorification of God. They are living in a devoutly, uniformly religious time, okay? And nice job, guys. Yeah, Mahul, Trinity, great job. That's absolutely right. They're glorifying God, right? And so that's what we're doing here. So let's continue reading on here. Good predictions. Okay. Each of the great soaring medieval cathedrals, our most treasured legacy from that age, required 3 or 4 centuries complete. Canterbury Cathedral, which is in southern England, was 23 generations in the making. Chartres Cathedral, a former Druidic center, 18 generations rather. Yet we know nothing of the architects or builders. They were glorifying God. To them, their identity in this life was irrelevant. Noblemen had surnames, last names. My last name is Mr. Knight, okay? You all have surnames as well. Noblemen had surnames at this time, but fewer than 1% of the souls in all of Christendom, all of Christian Europe, were considered nobles, well-born. Typically, the rest, which made up nearly 60 million Europeans at that time, were known as Hans, Jacques, Sal, Carlos, Will, Will's wife, Will's son, okay, which is where we get the name Wilson, okay, all right, or John's son, Johnson, okay, that's where these names come from, or even Will's daughter. Back in the olden days, they would sometimes put, like in Germany, Dotter, okay, so like, Magnus' daughter, okay, was a last name at that time, okay, if that, or it eventually evolved into a last name. If that was inadequate or confusing, a nickname would do, because most peasants lived and died without leaving their birthplace. There was seldom any need for any tag beyond One Eye, Russie, meaning redhead, Bionda, Blondie, or something similar. Their villages were frequently innominate, meaning without names, for the same reason. If war took a man even a short distance from a nameless hamlet, the chances of his returning to it were slight. He could not identify it, and finding his way back alone was virtually impossible. Each hamlet was inbred, isolated, unaware of the world beyond the most familiar local landmark, which would have been a creek or a mill or a tall tree scarred by lightning. There were no newspapers, no magazines to inform the common people of great events. Occasional pamphlets might reach them, but they were usually theological, meaning religious in nature, and like the Bible, were always published in Latin, a language they no longer understood. Now, between 1378 and 1417, and this starts to get to some of the content in chapter 11 of your book that you've been answering questions on last week, Popes Clement VII and Benedict XIII reigned in Avignon, excommunicating, Avignon is in southern France, excommunicating Rome's Urban VI, Boniface IX, Innocent VII, and Gregory XII, who excommunicated them right back. So we see a schism in the church where there's a pope and there's an anti-pope. And so basically think of it as two papacies, this great schism that happens, sometimes known as the Avignon papacy, okay? And so they both excommunicated each other. But here's the thing. Yet the toiling peasantry, toiling meaning like working all the time, or just like toiling isn't necessarily working all the time. It's more just like, it's almost, think of it like being on a treadmill. It's kind of just constantly like concerned or not really making any progress for you, just kind of like running in circles a little bit. That's kind of what toiling is, okay? It's like menial existence. The toiling peasantry was unaware of the estrangement in the church. Who would have told them? The village priest knew nothing himself. His archbishop had every reason to keep it quiet. The folk were baptized, shriven, attended mass, received the host at communion, married, and received the last rites, never dreaming they should be informed about great events, let alone have any voice in them. Their anonymity approached the absolute. Anonymity, okay? So these are people who really have, on top of the fact that they have no real personal identity or ego, these are people who believe of themselves that they don't really even have any business to have a voice in anything, okay? Think about in modern day times, if you were to describe somebody as so anonymous, okay, that they're reaching the brink of absolute anonymousness, okay, it would almost be like a forgotten person, all right? And so their anonymity approached the absolute, so did their mute acceptance of it. And they don't even question it. They just accept that they know that they are this meaningless, identityless peasant, essentially. In later ages, when identities became necessary, their descendants would either adopt the surname of the local lord, which is where we get, like last names that match their local landlord. Okay, a custom later followed by American slaves after their emancipation, who took the names of the slave holders that existed in the South, okay? Or take the name of an honest occupation, which is where we get last names like Miller, Taylor, Smith, because they come from their occupation. Even then, they were casual in spelling it. And it goes over some spellings there. I'm not going to go that. But it says, among the implications of this lack of selfhood was an almost total indifference to privacy. In summertime, peasants went about naked. In the medieval mind, there was also no awareness of time. This is another cool argument. Notice what he does here at the start of this paragraph. He lets you know everything else that this paragraph is going to be about. That's called a topic sentence, what he did right here. And you're going to be expected to do those on DBQs. Okay, so what he's doing here is he's setting up everything. He's going to now go into detail about time, or a lack of awareness of time of medieval folks. All right, so which is even more difficult to grasp from the modern perspective. Inhabitants of the 20th century, from when this was written, and even now in the 21st century, okay, inhabitants of the 20th century are instinctively aware of past, present, and future. At any given moment, most can quickly identify where they are on this temporal scale. The year, usually the date or the day of the week, and frequently by glancing at their wrists, or nowadays at your phones, the time of day. Medieval men were rarely aware of which century they were living in. There was no reason they should have been. There are great differences between everyday life in 1791 and 1991. If we think about when this book was written, he's comparing a 200-year difference there. He says that there's huge differences in the way of everyday life of how people lived between 1791 and 1991. But there were very few differences between 791 and 991. In other words, what he's trying to make here is the argument to say that in some sense, time passed by much more slowly back in the late Middle Ages. Why? Because there was almost no development. People went about for centuries, not even really knowing in many corners of Europe, where you're living in the middle of nowhere, what century you're in. Life then revolved around the passing of the seasons and such cyclical events as religious holidays, harvest time, and local feasts. Feasts are like festivals. In all Christendom, there was no such thing as a watch, a clock, or apart from the Easter tables in the nearest church or monastery, anything resembling a calendar. Generations succeeded one another in a meaningless, timeless blur. In the whole of Europe, which was the world as they knew it, very little happened. Popes, emperors, and kings died and were succeeded by new popes, emperors, and kings. Wars were fought, spoils divided, meaning like the bounty that you get from the war. Communities suffered, then recovered from natural disasters. But the impact on the masses was negligible. This lockstep continued for a period of time roughly corresponding in length to the time between the Norman conquest of England in 1066 and the end of the 20th century. For those of you who can do math, that's about 1,000 years, just under 1,000 years. And I want you to imagine that. Think about the progress that we have made in just the last 10 years, okay? In the year 2009, which is the first year, 2008, 2009, was the first year that I ever saw the original Apple iPhone. And think about how much has happened since then, okay? Smartphones in the last 10 years have changed absolutely everything, all right? This guy's saying they went for 1,000 years with almost no advancement, that time essentially stood still for nearly a millennium. And that is really hard to grasp, okay, for the modern person because of how quickly, comparatively, modern times change. Even during the Great Schism, actually, I'm gonna skip past that part there. All right. I haven't quite finished what I was saying before. Any innovation was inconceivable. And innovation is like an improvement on an existing device. Any innovation or idea was inconceivable. To suggest the possibility of one would have invited suspicion. And because the accused were guilty until they had proven themselves innocent, if you've ever heard like that phrase about on cop shows or maybe lawyer shows or whatever, anything dealing with the judicial system, which is that you're innocent until proven guilty. That's like, a standard of our due process here in the United States when you get accused of a crime. All right. You're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Back in the olden days, if you were accused of something, you were considered guilty until you proved your innocence. So the burden of proving your innocence was on the accused. Okay. Whereas in modern times, the burden of proof is on the accuser. If you're accused of stealing something, they have to prove that you did that. Okay. Not in the olden days. So, and then the way that they would go about proving their innocence was to survive some impossible ordeal by way of fire, water, or combat. To be suspect was to be doomed. And the reason that I love that line, to be suspect was to be doomed. And the reason it's so great is because if you think about it, from our modern day times, we're encouraged to question. My whole class is about getting you to question things, to be suspicious, okay? To say, hey, is this really right? Is this something we can trust? Okay, is this based in fact? Is this based in reality? Or is this some sort of like, bunch of hoopla that we're listening to right now, okay? But in those times, you were encouraged not to think to an extent. There was a kind of a fundamental belief amongst society that you shouldn't think for yourself. To think for yourself was dangerous. To come up with new ideas was dangerous, all right? And other people believed this too. So if you were one of these people coming up with a new invention, coming up with a new idea, questioning, speculating, challenging held beliefs, you were going to bring suspicion on yourself, and bringing suspicion on yourself meant that you were almost surely doomed. So when I said last week that when I'm trying to pluck you out of the water here in this historical stream of 2020 and drop you back in the stream in the 1350s, I said that the likelihood that you would survive the week, much less maybe even the day, all right, is pretty low, because your whole framework of understanding identity, yourself, society, science, medicine, even space or biology or simple things, all right, is so far beyond the capacity of somebody living in that time that you would stick out like a sore thumb, and it would draw a lot of suspicion on you, and probably they would kill you. Okay, good thing we can't time travel, right? All right, so even during the Great Schism, I'm going to skip that part there. Flip it over, go to the next, or scroll down rather, go to the next one, and I'm going to skip forward here a little bit. There's a part here where it's, talking about cities. The largest cities in Europe were Paris, Naples, and Venice, with about 150,000 inhabitants each. Those are rather large cities for that time. Other cities were a bit smaller. But I'm going to actually skip to, and I'm on this page here now, 47, where it says 20th century urban areas. Okay, 20th century urban areas are approached by superhighways. If you've ever driven like along the 10 freeway towards Los Angeles, you can see the giant skyscrapers, okay? Superhighways with skylines looming in the background. Municipalities back in the olden days, small cities, were far humbler then. Emerging from the forest and following a dirt path, a stranger would confront the grim walls and turrets of a town's defenses. Visible beyond them would be the gabled roofs of the well-to-do, the huge square tower of the donjon, which is just dungeon. And there's like two different dungeons. There's the dungeon, which is the like big building in the middle, and then there's the dungeon, which is like below the dungeon. Okay, the spires of the parish churches, and dwarfing them all, the soaring mass of the local cathedral. The cathedral was always built with a huge spire, which would shoot straight up to the sky, which of course was like about getting closest to heaven. Okay, if the bishop's seat was the spiritual heart of the community, The dungeon, which was overshadowing the public square, was its secular nucleus. On its roofs, 24 hours a day, stood watchmen, ready to strike the alarm bells at the first sign of attack or fire. Below them, because fires were happening all the time back in those days, houses would burn down and stuff like that. They built their stuff out of wood, sometimes stone. All right, but fires were very common in local areas because you have open flame everywhere. It gets dark at night. The only way to light the world was quite literally by fire. Okay, below them lay the council chamber where elders gathered to confer and vote. Beneath that, the city archives, and in the cellar, the dungeon and the living quarters of the hangman, who was kept far busier than any executioner today. Putting people to death was very common back in those days. 16th century men, referring to the 1500s, did not believe that criminal characters could be reformed or corrected. So, the idea behind prison today is it's supposed to be about a correctional institution. You're supposed to teach people how to live better. I won't get into the fact that a lot of people who go to prison come out and recommit crimes, but the point is that there was no belief that criminal characters could be reformed. So there were no reformatories or correctional institutions. Indeed, prisons as we know them did not exist. Maiming and the lash, meaning like, flogging people or something like that, were common punishments for convicted felons. The rope was commoner still, so they would hang them. The dungeon was the last line of defense, but it was the wall, the first line of defense, which determined the propinquity inside. The smaller its circumference, the safer and cheaper the wall was. Propinquity is kind of like the development of propinquity is almost like crime, not really crime, but like the determination of how much crime and villainy you would encounter in the middle of a city was dependent on how big the city was. The smaller the circumference of the wall, the safer and cheaper the wall was. Therefore, the land within was invaluable, and not an inch of it could be wasted. The twisting streets were as narrow as the breadth of a man's shoulders. It's not like today where streets are nice and wide and we could get a bunch of cars through and stuff like that. They were very, very narrow. And pedestrians bore bruises from collisions with one another. There was no paving. Shops opened directly onto the streets, which were filthy. Excrement, urine, and offal is like animal entrails, were simply flung out windows. And it was easy to get lost. Sunlight rarely reached the ground level because the second story of each building was always jutted out over the first to try to maximize the land that they had in these places. And then the third would be hanging over the second, and so on. Okay, at the top, a height approaching that of the Great Wall, burghers meaning like city folk, could actually shake hands with neighbors across the way. Rain rarely fell on pedestrians, for which they were grateful, and little air or light, for which they weren't. At night, the town was scary. Watchmen patrolled it, and once clocks arrived, they would call 1 o'clock and all's well. And heavy chains were stretched across street entrances to foil the flight of thieves. Nevertheless, rogues lurked in dark corners. One neighborhood of winding little alleys offered signs for those who could read them that the feudal past was receding. Here were found the Butcher's Lane, the Papermaker Street, Tanner's Row, Cobbler's Shop, Saddlemakers. If you've ever played the game Skyrim, it's kind of like when you go into a small town in Skyrim, right? There's there's like the Merchants Guild, and there's like little shops and other things like that you can go into and buy goods, blacksmiths, tailors, people like that, merchants, okay, shoemakers, you name it. Their significance lay in their commerce. Europe had developed a new class, the merchants. The hubs of medieval business had been Venice, Naples, and Milan, among only a handful of cities with over 100,000 inhabitants. Then the Medicis of Florence had entered banking. Finally, Germany's century-old Hanseatic League stirred itself and overtaking the others for a time dominated trade. And by the way, those are all talked about in your book. We talk about the Medicis coming up and other things like that. The Medicis being a banking family, a family that was able to make a lot of money by essentially lending money and then commissioning a bunch of art and so on and so forth. So I know that we took the majority of time to read this today, but I really enjoy this reading because I think it does such a fantastic job of setting up for you the historical discourse. And also it's an entertaining read that gives you an opportunity to start employing some of these techniques that we've been talking about on how to become a little bit more analytical reader, all right? Questioning things as we read them and then making predictions and also categorizing the information. So when we start talking about the merchant class, we're talking about social classes, but we're also talking about economics, right? Size of cities and other things like that, and the kinds of services that were offered in these cities. So if I was to categorize this document in total, I would say probably mostly social history, but he does touch on a couple of things relating to economic history and political history as well. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside now, all right? And we are going to use the rest of this time to start looking a little bit at the PowerPoint for today. Now, is there anyone, I want to ask a quick question at this time. Is there any, what time are we at here? 8:33? Okay. Is there anyone, we still got some time left. That's great. Is there anyone who does not have a book yet, a textbook? Because I want to know if I still need to take pictures of today's reading assignment to post onto Canvas for you. By the way, if you didn't yet submit your questions that were due for today, do not forget to do that. Okay, so a few people that don't have a textbook yet, thank you so much for chiming in. I will then go ahead and take pictures of today's, okay, perfect, that's fine, no problem, excellent. I will take pictures of the reading today and I will post that onto Schoology so that you can have that for today, and for those of you that do not have a textbook yet. So no problem on that, I'll make sure to do that. I haven't done it yet, but that will go up by around, I don't know, probably about 10 or 10:30 today, okay? Something like that. All right, so at this time, we're gonna go ahead and open up the PDF for Unit 1, which is a PowerPoint actually. It's just in PDF format so that I know that you can open it. And that is going to say the Late Middle Ages PDF, okay? So open up the Late Middle Ages. That's really the focus of our lecture today, the Late Middle Ages PowerPoint. Again, this is in the Files section and in the Lecture PowerPoints folder on Canvas. Okay, so I'll give you a second to do that. And as you're doing that, I'm going to jump into talking about some big ideas here. So last week, as we were getting started, and I know that this class gets off pretty briskly, okay? I try and get you through that first part of the reading, the first chapter we're already done with. So by the way, now that you're listening to me talk about this should be stuff that sounds familiar to you if you did that assignment on questions from chapter 11 and the one that was due for today, which again, don't forget to submit that. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the Black Death, okay? AKA the bubonic plague, which struck Europe from 1347 to 1350 and left 25 million Europeans dead. That's about 35% of the entire population of the continent of Europe at that time. Now, interestingly enough, for the first time ever teaching this class, we are now in the middle of a global pandemic. But I have to tell you that the COVID pandemic is very, very different from the Black Death. The COVID, first of all, is a virus, okay? The Black Death is caused by a plague, which is a bacteria. The reason that we don't see plagues spread across society anymore is because bacterial infections can be knocked out with a round of antibiotics, okay? So yes, that's right, the Late Middle Ages PowerPoint. That's exactly what we're doing. Okay, so sorry about that, Victor. I didn't see that question until right now, okay? Yeah, all right, thank you, Mahul, appreciate that. All right, so they're very different. Today, you can't, if COVID, you can't go to the doctor and get antibiotics for COVID. It's not going to do anything for you, okay? It's not effective in treating it. No doctor would do that, okay? Which is why we're waiting on a vaccine for it, because that's the only way that you can prevent yourself from getting a virus. But the plague was a bacteria, and the thing about bacteria is that they have a tendency to kill you very, very, very quickly. Now, I understand that with COVID, which is a very deadly illness, the The thing with COVID, though, is that with an otherwise relatively healthy person who doesn't have any other underlying conditions like lung problems or diabetes, or maybe they have advanced age, or maybe they have an autoimmune disorder, there are a number of a lot of the times with COVID, the deaths that COVID causes, I'm not saying every scenario, there are people who have no underlying issues that have still become very ill. But in the vast majority of cases, the people who die from COVID were also kind of sick to begin with, okay, or of a fragile age. The thing with bacteria is that can take an otherwise extraordinarily healthy person and kill them within a few days, okay, if you don't get antibiotics. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about plagues. Plagues actually, they do still exist in the world today, and they still exist in America today. But it's really not amongst humans that they exist. If you go up into Colorado, every year you'll hear stories of in the news of like a hiker that goes up into the mountains in Colorado and gets bit like by a prairie dog that has the plague, and they end up having technically the plague. But when they go to the doctor, okay, even though they might have like literally like the black plague, all right, the doctor will give them penicillin or whatever, amoxicillin, some sort of antibiotics, and it'll kill it and it'll knock it out and you'll be fine. All right. So people don't, die of it anymore unless you're living in there was actually a plague outbreak, I think, in Madagascar a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. All right. But anyhow, it happens. Okay. They do still exist, but now modern medicine helps to prevent it from spreading and killing folks. So how did it spread back in the olden days? Well, it spread from trade. So it came over from the Middle East originally because the Mediterranean Sea was the center of European trade at that time. And the Italian city-states that existed, and remember, Italy's a giant peninsula. It looks like kind of a women's high-heeled boot, okay, that kind of juts out into the Mediterranean Sea. Italy has a really, really prime location for Mediterranean trade. And remember that going back to William Manchester's argument today, the entire continent of Europe was stuck in this motionless, timeless blur, where not only the days, but the years and the centuries kind of all blended together in this period of time where people really weren't advancing, where Christianity just dominated the entire social, economic, and political framework of all of Europe at this time. And there was very, very little like innovation and invention and stuff like that. But as Europe starts to go through this transformation where we're now entering into the Renaissance, Italy is situationed geographically perfectly to be the first place to see a cultural change. And it's because they are trading with the far more advanced and in many ways actually far more tolerant society of the Ottoman Empire, which was a largely Muslim society, but also had Christians and Jews living within the Ottoman Empire as well. And comparatively speaking, actually, the Muslim Empire was far more tolerant today, despite what we hear today in the news media about the Middle East and some of the global terrorism and sexism and other things that happen in the Middle East today, as the media portrays it, okay, as being kind of a little bit more harsh society to live in, all right? In the olden days, the Ottoman Empire was actually slightly less harsh than Christian European society in the late Middle Ages, which was extraordinarily brutal. And so as we move forward here, keep that in mind, that it's really thanks to the Ottoman Empire that we have any of the art that survived from the Roman Empire, from the ancient Greek Empire, ancient texts and other texts and things like that, okay, exist because the Ottomans preserved them, okay? The Muslims preserved these cultural artifacts, and then in time, right about the dawn of the Renaissance, they start trading some of these items back to Italy as historical artifacts. In Italy and across Europe, a lot of the ancient ruins of the Roman Empire, the Colosseum was used as like basically a poor person's shelter for like hundreds of years after the fall of Rome. Okay, all of these symbols of ancient Rome were considered paganism. The Christians sought to destroy the remnants of the Roman Empire, which had fallen so many hundreds of years ago. So how did they get all of it back? It was because the Ottomans preserved it and traded it back to them. Okay, decades of overpopulation, economic depression, famine, and bad health made Europeans very vulnerable. And the other thing to remember at this time is one of the other reasons and this should be on everybody's radar nowadays, with all of the mandates about wearing masks, which has very stupidly now become a political issue, or the ideas about washing your hands or using hand sanitizer or other things like that. It's because we have an understanding in modern day times of a link between hygiene and the spreading of communicable illness, all right? Back in those days, people were living in very close quarters. As you read in William Manchester's piece today, okay, people are, the streets are filled with excrement. People don't shower because a lot of illnesses are waterborne. So if you get in the shower, the water's going to be dirty. There is really they don't have modern plumbing and stuff like that. So there really wouldn't even be a shower. You'd have to bathe. But they didn't understand things like about, it's like to expose yourself to that, we're almost taking a greater risk by taking a bath because you're entering yourself into dirty water that could make you sick, okay? And so people didn't bathe. You could go months without bathing, and people were truly disgusting, okay? Really, really gross. And so it's just a dirty time, and these illnesses like the plague spread very rapidly with the close quarters and, people coughing, and it was just a disgusting environment to live in. None of you would envy the folks who had to live through this in history. And then remember, medicine's very primitive at this time. They have no idea what's causing people to get sick, and even less of an idea of how to treat people who are already sick, except for they do have some idea that they're not completely stupid. It's that they just don't have any scientific explanations for anything, right? They do have some idea that if you're exposed to somebody who has the plague, the likelihood of you getting the plague was much higher. So they do have an idea about the communicability of it, but they have no explanation for how it works. Is it spirits? Is it God? Is it the smell? There was a belief that the smell was what gave you the sickness, actually. And so doctors would wear these long beak-looking masks filled with dried herbs and flowers. Kind of like if you've ever seen in the olden days, grandparents and stuff like that used to have potpourri in their house. Potpourri is herbs and dried spices and stuff like that. Might smell like cinnamon or flowery or something like that. They would stuff these long beaks with potpourri so that they wouldn't be able to smell, because what happens when you have the plague is a bacterial infection that results in literally, they call it the Black Death because it kills your tissue. It causes necrosis of your, and so you're alive, but your body's already rotting because your fingers are dead, okay, or your toes, all right, and it just creeps, and it's extremely painful, and it's very, very gross, okay, and so they would, you smell like a corpse when you have it, even though you're not dead yet. And so they thought that smell was how the sorry, my lights are going off here. They thought that smell, come back on. This is so dumb. I hate the lights in this class. All right. So they thought the smell was what spread the illness, and they tried the doctors of that time tried to avoid getting it. But of course, they're not wearing N95 masks. It didn't offer them virtually any protection, really. Okay, so as you look at the next slide there, the slide that I'm on right now is literally just like the third or fourth slide. It's a map of Europe with some purple lines on it, and these lines designate kind of areas from which the plague spread northwards. You're going to see those lines have different dates on them, and you can see that it kind of spreads from the south directionally towards the north. Now, this was not the only plague to hit Europe. Europe goes through plagues all the time. This is just like the biggest one. All right, it kills a third of the population. The people who survived were just lucky, really, at the end of the day. They were born with the appropriate set of immunities to be able to fight off the illness or not become sick from it. All right, and that's another thing about it, is that there were some people who would be around sick people and not get sick, and there was no understanding why they didn't get sick, right? But plagues come and go, really, for the next several hundreds of years. Different diseases and plagues sweep through Europe and kill people all the time. And it keeps the population pretty balanced, because if any of you took AP Human Geography, at this time in the late Middle Ages, we've got a very, very, very high birth rate, but it's accompanied by a very, very high death rate. So population was very much kept in check by things like war, famine, diseases like the plague, and natural disasters and other things like that. So people have to have a whole lot of kids, because there's anything but a guarantee that you're going to be able to live to adulthood. And people needed to have a lot of kids, particularly in rural areas, because it's not only a matter of sustaining the population, which is extraordinarily vulnerable at this time, but also a product of creating enough kids to help out as farmhands and stuff like that. The more kids you have, the more chores you can assign them around the house, and your local little farm can prosper. Okay, so moving forward to the next one, Black Death. Europeans were absolutely terrified of death. And one of the major outcomes of this that we need to address is that because the Black Death was so unpredictable, think how freaked out people were when the COVID first hit, right? People were totally freaked out about it. But they're freaked out even in a time when we have a whole lot of explanation and scientific understanding of how illness works and immunology and all of this sort of thing. All right, back in this day, they have none of that. So think about how terrified they are, particularly because in those times, the one thing that they were most concerned about was getting to heaven. So if you died before you thought your time should have been up, maybe you didn't get to do your last rites with your local priest before you died. And one of the big outcomes of the Black Plague is that we see this expansion in the notion of purgatory. And this is going to play a big role coming up in the second unit of our class, which is the Protestant Reformation. Because people became so fearful of going to hell upon meeting an untimely end as a result of the plague, the Roman Catholic Church's response to this was to try to essentially make some money off of it. And what they began doing was selling these things called indulgences, which were kind of like, if you've ever played the game Monopoly, kind of like get out of jail free cards that you get from the chance deck or whatever, okay, except for it's a get out of hell or purgatory free card. And what this did was it was a way for particularly wealthy people, obviously, which most people in Europe are not. So this favored the wealthier folks in Europe. It was the service that the church provided to say, well, maybe if grandma died quickly, and she didn't have a chance to confess her sins with her last rites on her deathbed, okay, maybe she's not in hell. Maybe she's in purgatory, which is like the waiting room for heaven or hell. And this idea of purgatory expands greatly. It had been really not a big thing that the Catholic Church focused on much, and the idea of it wasn't well known until after the Black Death, where the Roman Catholic Church expands on this idea of purgatory of like, well, hey, their salvation hasn't been determined yet. They're kind of in this intermediary stage of the afterlife where it hasn't been determined whether they go to heaven or hell. But if you buy an indulgence, grandma doesn't have to spend the next 1,000 years in purgatory. Her soul can be lifted into heaven at a faster rate. And so the church started essentially collecting funds to be able to support churchly activities like building massive cathedrals and commissioning huge pieces of art like frescoes on the ceilings of the buildings and stuff like that. So indulgences are the outcome of this. And there's a very deliberate reason that I'm bringing all of this up, because it's going to play a huge factor in Unit 2 of our class. And then there's obviously a whole bunch of economic consequences as well. Lots of depopulation. The people who got hit the hardest, of course, were the peasants. And so we have a labor shortage, right? There's a labor shortage that happens in Europe. This is all economic history, right? What happens if there's a labor shortage? That means that there isn't enough stuff being built anymore. So the people that are left over are able to actually kind of improve their lot in life a little bit because they can charge more for their services because what they make is in high demand because the people who used to make it are now all dead and you're the only one left. Okay, so they kind of actually, artisans and merchants have a tendency to benefit a little bit from this. Wages increase, especially for them. And then cities end up starting to rebound a little bit after this by passing laws to regulate competition with rural areas and control immigration. Expensive clothes and jewelry, furs and silks came into very high demand because there's very, very few of them around at this time, particularly silks, which they had to get from all the way over in Asia, which is cut off by the Ottomans. Remember that the Ottomans are largely Muslim and they don't get along well with the Christians. They've been warring with one another for several hundred years by the time that we get to the start of the Renaissance. There was at this time, the way that stuff was built was through something called the guild system, the master apprentice system. We still sometimes see the master apprentice system used today in some things like carpentry or plumbing or electricians or things like that. We do still sometimes see it, but back in those days, it was for virtually every craft. And the guild system, the thing that I can think of it that's kind of similar to it, but not quite the same as modern time, is kind of like a labor union. Okay, the guild system had rules and regulations about how they operated, and they had taxes and other things that they that they charged for their services, and it was a very highly regulated entity, and you had to go through the guild system in order to acquire certain goods within cities. Circumventing the guild system may have gotten you into some trouble. Okay, so the next major thing here is the 100 Years' War. That should have been also something that you read about last week. I am winding down on time here. I only have 6 minutes left. Before I forget, I would like you guys to tell me today, to take attendance, the way we're going to take attendance today, I want to hear, what is your favorite food? Tell me if you had to pick any meal that's your favorite. It's your birthday, you want to go out to dinner and have any meal that you want, what would it be? Type it in there. I'm anxious to see what you say. Anything as long as it's spicy, French fries. What else? I'm taking attendance with this, so please do respond. Sushi, some type of pasta, potatoes and spicy, boneless wings, ramen, French fries, tamales, pasta, pizza, chicken nuggets. Oh, you guys are easy. Where's the steak and lobster? No one likes steak and lobster? Chicken nuggets? Hey, it's what you like. All right, I think that's everybody. Cool, thanks so much. So the last thing that we're gonna talk about here, I really don't have much time to talk about this. I hate steak. I'm sorry to hear that. That's the, oh, okay, thank you, Natalia. Okay, the 100 Years' War. Really quickly, 100 Years' War, we're going to talk more about that next class as we start to transition into talking about how politics change. England and France start to undergo centralization of their kingdoms at this time. And so that's going to be one of the main factors. You're going to be reading about the new monarchs. There's going to be some new monarchs that come into power, and we're going to go all into this on Wednesday. There's going to be some new monarchs that come into power that begin to very scrupulously centralize their empire or their realm. Okay, so that increasingly the power of the state is centered under the control of the single monarch. Previously to this, remember that monarchs faced a whole lot of challenges to their authority, and they still will, okay, to some extent. But we're starting to see this centralization process where we see these new monarchs emerge in France and England. And it just so happens that in the 1300s, they're warring with one another for about a century. Now, when I say they're warring with one another, I don't mean 100 straight years of war. They kind of start, they stop, they pick up again, they stop. It kind of is like it's intermittent, 100 years worth of wars that's intermittent. Okay, and there's some comparisons here between France and England, France being the far larger and far wealthier. England, as much as we might know and think we know about England in history, England's very much the late bloomer of Europe. Okay, you have to keep in mind that in the 13, 14, and even into the 1500s, England is the small kid on the block. Okay, England's late to the game. All right, they're very late to the game. The Dutch are far faster to the game. They develop things much more quickly than the English do. The English are very late to, like, for example, coming over to America and establishing colonies in America. Okay, they're one of the last nations from Europe to travel across the ocean and start establishing colonies in North America. All right, but England, even though they're late starters, they're pretty good finishers. All right, because they end up being the most dominant power, but not until we get until like the 1700s. Okay, so it's going to be a while before England really comes to full maturation in terms of its global influence. All right, in these times, England's like small, it's weak. France is far stronger, and they're both relatively decentralized and in this feudal state where local lords and distant regions have a lot more influence than the king does. But as we finish the 100 Years' War, what's going to end up happening is that they begin this process of centralizing their realms. And we will talk about that when we get there on Wednesday. So for today, before I sign off, I want to just make sure that I tell you that we will have some more questions to answer from the reading guide. I will be putting in the grades for the ones that you submit for today. Please do that as soon as possible so that you don't have a blank square in your grade. They should be done by now. You do technically, though, have until 11:59. If you haven't submitted it by the time that I put them in the grade book, I'll handle it tomorrow, and you should be good. And so thank you so much for tuning in this morning, and have a great rest of the day.